1st, and October, you know when good movies come out in the, right around Christmas time? Well, good books come out right around now, and all the publishers hold the really good books for now. So we're getting a number of great books to come along. And yesterday, somebody put this book in my hand, and I looked at it. It's called Rebel Souls, Walt Whitman and America's First Bohemians, written by our next guest, Justin Martin, who joins us via Skype. Good morning, Justin. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. My pleasure.
Okay, now look, when they put this book in my hand yesterday, I thought to myself, who would want to read this? And I opened it up, and I cannot put this book down. It is a great yarn. It's a great story. And it's a story that you write, Justin, that everybody expected this book to be written, but nobody wrote it.
That is right. That is right. And this was an amazing group of America's first Bohemians who gathered in this basement saloon in New York City during the 1850s. They were so important in their day. People were just certain someone would document their tale with a book, and it didn't happen in the 1850s, it didn't happen in the 1870s, it didn't happen in the 19th century, or the 20th century. So finally getting around to it.
How did you come across this story?
Well, I was chatting with a professor, and he asked me, have you ever heard of Pfaff's Saloon? And I said no. And, people are constantly giving me book ideas. So I didn't think much of it. He said, well, you should really look into it. I started looking into it. I quickly determined it was just an amazing story, and I was hooked.
Pfaff's Saloon, it's spelled P-H. AFFS. Who is that a name? How did that name come about?
That's the name of the proprietor, a German immigrant named Charles Ignatius Pfaff. He was the man who founded the saloon and kind of set in motion its kind of welcoming libertine atmosphere that's just right for Bohemians.
And it's so fascinating. You tell the story in the book. There's a shoe store there now.
That's correct. That's right. Yeah, we're talking about a saloon that was last in business there in the early 1860s. There must have been dozens, tens of different tenants since then. The most current one is a discount women's shoe store.
And you walked in the door and you said, by the way, did you know that this was once a famous bar?
That's right. You can say that, and they'll say, you want to buy some shoes?
So are there any remnants of the bar left?
It's incredible. Not really. I mean, one of the interesting things is you got into the bar by lifting a hatchway in the Broadway sidewalk, and you walk down a tall, narrow ladder into the subterranean bar below. Well, there's still a hatchway in the Broadway sidewalk. I don't think it's the original hatchway. I don't think it's the original ladder. It takes you down to the old basement space. But as you can imagine, 150 years worth of renovations and changes, there's no traces. Other than the fact this is the same space where these people once met, it's now utterly transformed. It's simply a basement for storage, piled high with stiletto heels.
Yeah. The book is called Rebel Souls, Walt Whitman and America's First Bohemians. Justin, I have to tell you, I had to look up the word Bohemian because I thought I knew what it was. I kind of didn't know what it was, and I always thought Bohemians were from Bohemia and from sort of that Prague area.
That's right. No, it's funny. What happened is you've got in Paris in the 1840s, which was kind of a time, kind of like the Vietnam War in the United States, you had people pouring into Paris, and the upper crust conservative Parisians couldn't make sense of who they were. Some of these people are kind of rebellious. So they started just calling them Bohemians on the kind of the mythical idea they might have come from the Central European kingdom of Bohemia. But many of them were just French revolutionary artists. Well, this guy named Henry Clapp happened to visit France at exactly this time. He got exposed to the term Bohemian in the French rendering of it. He came back to the United States and imported the concept Bohemian and also the term Bohemian to America. And he was the one who hung out at the Saloon Pfaff's and started bringing together this group of Bohemian artists.
Okay, Justin Martin, the author of the book Rebel Souls, who today is considered Bohemian?
Today, I'd say people that kind of espouse a lifestyle would be someone like Lena Dunham or Lady Gaga or the writer Dave Eggers. Now, one of the issues with Bohemianism is once you have a certain measure of success and make some money, it kind of disqualifies you, but they at least have those particular values. Who is truly Bohemian? the guy who crashed on your couch last weekend. That's those, and they're everywhere.
It's so. I mean, the old adage is true. I used to like The Cure until they became popular, and then I didn't like them anymore.
Exactly. There are bohemian artists everywhere at different levels of success, and at a certain point, of course, it becomes hard. I mean, I look at someone like Lady Gaga. As I said, she's communicating to a lot of bohemians, telling them, be unconventional, live free, etc. But she's traveling from place to place in a Learjet, I would guess.
Yeah. So how did you go about telling a story of a bar in Manhattan in the 1850s?
Well, part of the way that what made it possible is this was such a big deal in its day. These bohemians had their zeitgeist moment. They were kind of like different groups. Like I always think of the Seattle Sound in the early 1990s. With Nirvana and Pearl Jam. Well, this was the moment for these American bohemians, and so there were tons and tons of newspaper articles and books. Newspapers would dispatch reporters to go to FAFs and try to hang out with these bohemians and gather what they're all about. So nobody had necessarily consulted these old accounts, but there were lots of old accounts to go to. It made my job a lot easier.
So it was like the super inside cool club.
Very much. Now, this was a group of people that, and as you might imagine, a lot of articles that ran the 1850s in various newspapers would say, these bohemians are disreputable, they have shaggy hair, they drink, they misbehave, they chase women, etc. As you can imagine, those only made them sound all the more enticing when someone would read an article like that.
It was also, you write in the book Rebel Souls, one of the few bars that allowed women in it.
That's right. Yeah, this was a time of the 1850s was a time of real society. You had a lot of, in fact, typically women would go to a bar through a separate female-only entrance and order what was called a growler, an ale to go, which they would take home. But this particular saloon, because of its kind of European roots, it was founded by this guy who was a German immigrant. It had a more welcoming atmosphere, and so it certainly welcomed women. And the guy, Henry Clapp, I described earlier, who founded this group of bohemians in the saloon, he had a long table capable of seating about 30 people, and he had many of the regulars who sat at that long table were female artists.
Who was the stripper who used to hang out there?
There was a woman named Ada Isaacs Minkin, and she was an actress. She was kind of cunning, but also kind of vulnerable. I think of her almost like an old-fashioned Marilyn Monroe type. And she became very famous, notorious, you might say, during the late 1850s for her role in a play called Mazeppa, in which she got stripped down to a sheer flesh-colored body stocking. That it was, the theater lights in those days were really dim, so you couldn't tell whether she was naked or not. So that was that in that day or any day, she had a hit on her hands.
Also in this bar. And you allude to, 1850s, you say, we sort of laugh, drinking, oh, terrible. But it wasn't just drinking. It was drugs. It was sex. It was bisexual sex. It was all the things that are still kind of taboo today they were doing in the 1850s at this bar.
That's right. They got an early, I guess these things weren't discovered as many people think. In 2014, they've always been around. And these people were living it up and all kinds of, one member of the circle was a man named Fitzhugh Ludlow. He wrote one of the best-selling books of 1857 called The Hashish Eater, about detailing his experience as an undergraduate doing lots and lots of hashish. And he was one of the people who sat at that long table along with Ada Isaacs Minkin, the so-called naked lady, and Henry Clapp, the guy who imported the term bohemianism. So it was a wild and rowdy group.
So in 1857, we're on the cusp of the Civil War. How does the Civil War affect these guys? Do they even know, or are they in this drug-induced stupor having so much fun they don't even pay attention?
Well, it's kind of they were sort of partying as Rome fell, as per the old model. They were hanging out in this underground saloon, writing essays, creating various kinds of artwork, drinking, misbehaving. But in so many ways, the 1850s were kind of like the 1960s in America. It was a really tumultuous time. So they were kind of channeling, like artists are wont to do, they were kind of channeling the tumult in American society. And that was part of what probably made them misbehave, made them party so hard, and also caused so many of them, including Walt Whitman, that created such great art, was they were kind of channeling these feelings that were coursing through our society on the eve of the Civil War.
Walt Whitman was there before he was Walt Whitman.
That is right. Yeah, this was a younger Walt Whitman. Everybody tends to think of him as sort of this shaggy, gray bearded old man, but he was young once too. In fact, when he was young, he was on fire, creating some of his very finest poetry. And he was at Pfaff's Saloon nearly every night from 1858 to 1862. At night, he was kind of soaking it up, hanging out with the circle of artists. By day, he was unemployed at the time. By day, it left him a lot of time to write more than 100 new poems, which were really sort of the core of his landmark 1860 edition of Leaves of Grass.
Walt Whitman is the most famous now, but was he the most? So he clearly wasn't the most famous then, hanging out at the bar.
He certainly wasn't. In fact, he was maybe the most egotistical of the group. He had a sense that he was incredibly talented, but a lot of the other people resented him because they pointed out that, yeah, he comported himself like he was famous, but as one person said, he wasn't famous yet. So it kind of irritated some of the other people on the table. You had some folks like Artemus Ward, who was America's very first stand-up comic and who Abraham Lincoln just loved. He was miles ahead of Whitman career-wise at this early juncture.
When you took this book to your publishers and you said, I want to write about a bar in the 1850s, they must have looked at you like you were crazy.
Well, they did. At the same time, my editor is a huge fan of the play Cabaret, which of course is about a bunch of artists in Germany hanging out in a bar on the eve of fascism, of Nazism coming into Germany. When I communicated to her, this was kind of analogous. A group of artists hanging out in a bar as the tensions that would ultimately lead to the Civil War in America on the rise. She got it immediately. She loved the idea. And then it was just a matter of figuring out how to piece it all together.
Yeah. The book is called Rebel Souls. I saw this book and I thought to myself, what am I doing looking at this book? And I picked it up, and from the first moment, I've yet to be able to put this book down. It's called Rebel Souls, Walt Whitman and America's First Bohemians. How does Mark Twain intertwine in this story?
The way Mark Twain intertwines is Artemus Ward, America's first stand-up comic. He takes his act on the road. He goes out west, goes to Nevada and becomes fast friends with a young comic writer who only a few months earlier has adopted the pen name Mark Twain. In classic fashion, Twain's a young guy. He really looks up to Artemus Ward, who already has a lot of success, favorite of Lincoln, and so forth. And so Twain gives Ward some of his writing and says, will you share this back east with some of these powerful editors you know? Well, as it happens, one of the people, Henry Clapp, the man who sat at the head of this table, had his own journal called the Saturday Press, very influential journal for a short period of time. Well, the Saturday Press, Artemus Ward passes along a Mark Twain short story called The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. That's the story that breaks Mark Twain big, makes him a national figure. Before this, Mark Twain just had a small regional reputation as a Western writer. All of a sudden, through the Saturday Press, he reaches a big national audience. And with Twain, of course, the rest is history.
Wow, that is great. How is it, Justin, that nobody took the time to write this story for 150 years?
I think a big part of that to do with it, first everybody expected it would be written, and then it became kind of like a cold case. The trail went cold, and it's really, although information is there about these various celebrated figures, it's very widely dispersed in various newspapers around the country and various archives around the country. One thing that I can say with certainty is it's no coincidence, no surprise that this book was written in 2014, not 1974, 1934, because the internet helped me to make a lot of connections. I could enter in a name like Fitzhugh Ludlow, the hashish eater, and it would make the kind of connections I might find if there was a cache of letters at some far-off library that I could then go track down. It would have been a lot harder to do that. It would have been a lot harder to do that in 1934.
That is amazing. How long did Pfaff's Saloon stick around for? When did it close?
It actually, there were three different Pfaff's Saloon. One lasted until from the 1850s until 1865. Then it moved just a few doors uptown and lasted for another few years after the Civil War, from 1865 until maybe the early 1870s. Then, classic thing, it moved uptown. The West 24th Street became really respectable. Lots of much more respectable types of people poured in, hoping to get some of the old-fashioned Pfaff's flavor. Of course, the Bohemian artists had long ago moved on, and the bar lasted another year or two before it closed.
Wow. So it became so popular, nobody went there.
You got it, exactly.
Justin Martin, our guest for a few more moments. His new book is called Rebel Souls, Walt Whitman and America's First Bohemians. What would you want to ask one of the characters in your book if you had a chance?
Oh, let's see. What would I ask them? I would. I think I would ask Artemis Ward. Just what I'd do is I'd ask him to do one of his comedy routines for me. I mean, that's what I'd ask. Reading about the comedy routines, I got a flavor for the idea. This is one of the funniest people ever to exist. But you got to see it to believe it, and I'd love to see it.
Yeah. And then Hollywood come calling yet on this book?
Well, it's being looked at by some various studios, so fingers crossed on that one.
Yeah, no, this one is, it's a yarn and a half. Rebel Souls is the book, Walt Whitman and America's First Bohemians. Justin Martin joining us via Skype. Justin, thanks for joining us. Thanks for the story, and good luck with the book down the road.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it very much.
You got it. Rebel Souls, Walt Whitman and America's First Bohemians. Justin Martin, our guest. 927.